work I did on this program, I thought I'd be able to transfer the Harford County information, which I did last year. I did a program for the Harford County Historical Society about the Great Migration to Harford County. And I thought, it'll just ooze over the border into Cecil County. And then when I actually started looking at the Cecil County situation, I realized they're not particularly comparable. So I will say, are any of you descendants of people who came directly to Cecil County? If so, please raise your hand. Aha. And who?
Graybeals, and they came to Conley Road.
Very
in,
good, very
like
good.
1970.
Good. 19 when? 17?
17.
See, well, that was one of the first.
Right.
Of course. And are you Graybeal too?
No, I'm neighbors. They
Oh.
came right from down there to Rising Sun
At what year, do you know?
around 1915.
Oh, okay, so
Yeah.
pioneers. These were the pioneer families then, here. In Harford County, and how about you?
Oh, the Kleins came up in 1915.
Oh, really? That early too? And directly through Cecil County?
Yes.
Because my great-grandfather Osborne, who was Wiley Winton Osborne, was an old man in 1911. He had 6 children by his first wife, 6 children by his second wife. His my grandmother was his second child by his first wife. His oldest child with that wife died when she was 16. But, so my grandmother was the oldest surviving one of that lot. And so Grandpa Osborne had realized that he had to settle the estate. His children, his 6 children by his first wife, who had died when the youngest, who was about 1 or 2, had actually been the owner of the farm that they had lived on all those years. And they were all getting cranky because they wanted their birthright from their mother, who had been dead for years. And so he decided to sell the farm down there at Sturgill's on the Helton Creek that he had lived on forever, and that had belonged to the Mink family and the Sturgills prior to that for generations. So he sold it and moved to Maryland. And the reason he came to Maryland is that he had gotten word, he had heard through the grapevine, and one man had come up and discovered that in Maryland there were these vast estates crying for someone to come and work on them because the old families were beginning to die off, and they didn't have the children or the interest in staying around. So in 1911, he moved up to Cool Spring Farm in Harford County, a beautiful old farm. My family followed him my father's family followed him in 1915, and then one by one, all the rest of the family came up. So that kind of serial migration is what started it all. So my grandfather Osborne was one of the first, and they came to Harford County, intended to remain in Harford County. Then the Graybeals, Honeckers, and what was Klein.
Klein.
Do you know of any other early families? I came across Eastridge. I'm not sure they were here in the 15. Well, there was a Kilby family too that came early at Kilby's Corner, which is kind of Wingo area. But they were my father's like 4th cousins or something. So Kilby, Honecker, Graybeal, Klein, and I'm sure a few others, but there weren't a whole lot that came then. And they came up to farm, right? Yeah. Although, I have a little something to show you later when I get through my program. So that's how we came to be up here, and that's what started the whole movement. We'll go to this computer next. Oh, it works. I used the mind. I did this little graphic here to show you, obviously, the earliest group that came up were from right down here on the Virginia-North Carolina border. And as I said, they started about 1911. And the momentum grew, and also as time passed, the area from which the southern migrants came grew. There were generally, I think, 3 waves. There were the original pioneer people, the people who came up to buy farms, and then in the 1930s, late 20s and 30s, more and more people started coming up to work as tenants often on these farms, but also in manufacturing jobs and other jobs. And then finally, after World War II, there was another big wave. And I think Elkin became this, well, prior to World War II, a lot of people came up to work in the explosive plants there. And it was the whole idea, I guess, that you couldn't hire, nobody local would work there, but the people would come from down south and they would do those jobs. And so this, they headed up to Harford County, then over to Cecil County, and oozed over into southern Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania, and a little bit into Delaware and so forth. But that was generally the way it worked. And they came in family groups, neighborhood groups. Hardly anybody came along until the third wave. The first wave was all clumps of family. Then the second wave, with more of the tenant farmers, the people looking for jobs right now or work right now, they came often as individual families. And I found that when I was looking through the censuses, that there were more individual families and individuals, I think, coming into Cecil County directly, rather than those big mobs of families that came down. And you can see how the waves came. And I'll read this one. In 1900, there were only 294 people in Cecil County who were Virginia natives. And quite a number of them were actually older black men who had migrated up to the south part of the county. And there were maybe 12 from North Carolina natives and 11 West Virginia natives or something in the entire county. By 1910, the figure actually went down. 1920, you see the begin. This is the pioneers are here now. They have started buying the farms there, or inhabiting the farms. Sometimes they were renters, or often they were renters. 718 native-born Virginians, 143 North Carolinians, and 91 West Virginians. By 1930 or 1920, I'm jumping ahead here. No, that is 1930. 1,199 Virginia natives, 374 North Carolina natives, 236 West Virginia natives. And then finally, and the census, I can't get the census in 1950. I'd love to know if the census information is there, because that would show even further. But in 1940, 1,491 people had been born in Virginia. 680 North Carolinians, 286 West Virginians. In Harford County, way more of both Virginians, 2,700, and almost as many North Carolinians. So the mix was different. And in Harford County, the majority of us came from Grayson County and Ashe County, the two contiguous counties that are on these maps over here, to the west of both states, not all the way west in Virginia, because it keeps going on a tail over there that includes Washington County and Lee County, and so Russell County, I think, the very, very mountainous end of the world part of Virginia. So it shows you how many people started following that same trail north, looking for opportunity mostly. But the thing that interested me, because I've been studying the Fair Hill history, that's what I've most lately been working on. It's been half of my life doing the history of Fair Hill, Maryland, and some Cecil County history. And the interesting thing is that almost all the people who live down in that area, that Seminole area, originated right up here. Or these are where my families originated. All of my family lines go back to before the Revolution, except for my mother's grandparents, who immigrated from England in 1887. But every other line was here, pretty much in the central Atlantic, or there were a few families, I think, I know they were up in New London, Connecticut, and a couple came in at Jamestown area. but almost everybody in my family line started out here. Then around between 1740 and 1770, they headed to the border, to the frontier, basically. It had gotten too civilized, maybe, up here. And an awful lot of the Fair Hill people, the Alexander family, who were actually the first families in Fair Hill, were one of the earliest migrants to North Carolina. Now, they went over to the Charlotte area of North Carolina. And one of the Alexanders was the governor of the state. Many, many important people, all derived, as I say, from Fair Hill. I even discovered my father's family, his father's mother was a Jones, whose mother was a Long. And her father was the descendant of Tobias Long and, what was her first name? Martha Robinson Rich. Tobias Long lived in West Nottingham area of Cecil County. And one of my distant Long cousins asked me if I knew where this property might be, because he had a deed showing where Tobias Long was allowing a Colson to run his mill race through his property. Well, it was right next to the farm that my father came to buy in 1961. My father came to Cecil County from Harford County and bought a farm that was adjacent to the property his fifth great-grandfather had owned before he moved down to North Carolina. There are, Francises are in my line, and the Francises were also from Cecil County, supposedly. Who else? There may be the Penningtons, definitely. My mother was a Pennington. Penningtons started out, they came over with William Penn, and Cecil County was fraught with Penningtons in the southern part. And so who knows? I haven't been able to connect my Penningtons in the south to the Penningtons up here, but they have to be. They all came in the same place. So many of my lines come back right here to this area. And it's almost like a homing instinct or something. You all go south and then you turn around and come right back over here again, many generations later. I don't know if anyone else has studied your lines, but they probably, if you have some southern roots, you also have some Cecil County roots. Now, this book was an eye-opener to me, and I'm going to, the rest of the time I'm going to talk, it has a lot to do with what this book says, because this is a sociological study, and this man looked at at 4 different groups of people that settled America, and he looked at the way they lived in England and the way they lived in America, and he studied how, what different kinds of societies they created, or different kinds of worlds they created for their own group. And the first group to come, of course, were the Puritans in New England, and they had a certain way of raising their children and getting married and behaving and thinking of money and all that. The next group was the Cavalier culture that inhabited Virginia. The people with the big plantations, the indentured servants, eventually the slaves. They were usually the second sons of the wealthy people in England, and they came over and they continued that kind of class stratified life. Then there were the Quakers, of course, in the Brandywine, in the Delaware Valley, just north of Fair Hill, and I run into them a lot. And also, of course, Rising Sun. Rising Sun was purely Quaker. All the Nottingham lots across the north part of the county were Quakers. I just recently finished a farm history with Joanne Tosh, who lives at Harrisville. And the Quakers were, you just can't escape them. And they married so strongly into the Quaker. Nobody went over the line. And in fact, my Martha Robinson Rich, I was just telling you about, was a widow. She had been a Quaker, raised as a Quaker. She became widowed when she was young, and she started hanging out with this Tobias Long, who was not a Quaker, and they actually drummed her out of the Quaker faith, blaming her, fornication and other bad things. And so that's one of my ancestral stories. So the Quakers lived a very different life too, of course. And finally, the borderlands, the people who came to Fair Hill and that part of Cecil County came from the southern part of Scotland, the northern part of England, and then they usually migrated over, many of them migrated over to Northern Ireland, to Ulster, Ireland, where they were Protestants, but they didn't have to put up with the pesky English. And so this borderland personality, mentality, very much created the kind of society that then traveled down the Appalachian Mountains, down into the mountains, and it stayed there. So those are the characteristics that stuck, and they still stick there. I was astonished when I read this book. I said, oh, are there other ways to raise children? You mean other people don't raise their children this way? Other people don't elope, they don't do this, you know? And it's just, you know, when you're raised in a certain culture, you tend to think that's the only way, but there are other ways to organize your life. I'll read you this quote up here because, as I say, this is the basis for the rest of the organization that followed. To the first settlers, the American backcountry was a dangerous environment, just as the British borderlands had been. Much of the southern highlands were debatable lands in the border sense of a contested territory without established government or the rule of law. The borderers were more at home than others in this anarchic environment, which was well suited to their family system, their warrior ethic, their farming and herding economy, their attitudes toward land and wealth, and their ideas of work and power. So well adapted was the border culture to this environment that other ethnic groups tended to copy it. The ethos of the North British border came to dominate this dark and bloody ground, partly by force of numbers, but mainly because it was a means of survival in a raw and dangerous world. So, we Southerners started out with a pretty bleak a raw and dangerous world. But it really, when you think about how, as I say, there are other ways to do things. The family was really the heart of everything to the Southerners who were down there, and then they came back up here. And this is my father's family, this is my mother's family, but this is my father's family before the last three of them were born. The second beautiful lady up here is Aunt Ollie, who was the grandmother of her great-grandmother. These people, raise your hand, you just,
Grandma.
so all these people are just a few of her descendants. She had 11 children, I think, is that right? 11, how many?
She had 9.
Just, she was one
Nine.
of the smaller, 9. She had 9 children. But they all produced pretty well too, so there are lots of weaver cousins. She married a weaver down there.
Reproduced two at a time.
These two or three older girls were married at the time this picture was taken. My father, Grandma had 2 more children before my father was born. My father was the last born. All of these children were born either in Kentucky or North Carolina or Virginia. They kept going across the boundary line between North Carolina because Grandpa Kilby's home was directly on the state line, the great-grandpa Kilby. So they went back and forth frequently, or moved back and forth. I think most of the younger ones were born in North Carolina, but my father was the only one of the crew that was born in Maryland, and he was born a couple years after they moved up. They moved in 1915, and he was born in 1970. But when they moved up, just the younger ones were with them, but within at least 7 years, all the older family, older children's family had moved up to primarily around Harford County as well. Then they eventually spread out from there, but almost always they stayed within visiting distance of the family. This is my mother's family after they moved up here, and this is the Rocks, in case any of you know the Rocks. But there were only 8 in her family. Grandma had 1 more to bear at this point, but which was plenty to my mind. The family numbers have ever since dwindled away. It's very interesting. Once this family moved up to Maryland, there were several daughters that were still in school, and the one younger son was still in school when they moved up here. It didn't take the girls long to learn that maybe they didn't want to have 9 or 10 or 12 children themselves. And they just had 2 at the most. If they had 1 or 2 of them didn't have any. So I mean, there was such a cultural change moving up, and they didn't marry farmers either. They married outside the clan. In my mother's family, one of the sons remained a farmer, and his family's still on the family farm near Fountain Green. So mother and Charles were the only ones that remained on farms. The rest of that family left farms too, and they didn't have large families. So it didn't take those women long. Religion, very, very important. And you can see it was an organizing principle in the family as well. This is a Baptist baptism in the New River. I don't know whether you can see that or not there at Mercy. My family came up as Methodist and remained Methodist, but my father's family were Christian and went to Mountain Christian Church when they were up here. My grandfather, Kilby, was actually ordained a Baptist minister while he was down there, just before they moved up. He was supposed to give the most important fall, they have an annual homecoming in the Baptist church, and he was supposed to give the address that time. He was the main speaker, and then they moved to Maryland, so too bad. He was never famous. But he was a farmer, first of all. I mean, he was primarily a farmer, but he was also, he became an ordained preacher. This is the Methodist church down here, and this is homecoming. I can't imagine where all these people came from, but they were there. And this is about 1927. My great-grandfather Pennington is he looks like, what's his name? Sigmund Freud. He has a little white goatee and everything. I don't know where he got that fashion, but that's not a typical look. So, just that many people. Every Sunday you went to church, as you know, and after church you went to Grandma's house and you had lunch, where she served, 20, 50, 100 people. It was always chicken, fried chicken, gravy, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, corn or succotash, pickled beets, homemade rolls, cake, pie, maybe ice cream if you're lucky. I mean, it just goes on and on. And food was the center. Eating together was the center of family unity, along with working together. Those were the things. And my mother, she died in 2015. She died in 2015 at the age of 97, and up until the end, she was having family gatherings that will be no more, I'm sure. Nobody does that anymore. Schools, this was a school down in Virginia, Wolf's Knob, and four of my aunts are in here. Aunt Ollie's up there. Do you see her up there? Can you see that?
No.
The two cute, pretty little girls, they're about 10 and 11. And then I think these two down here are the younger girls. But this is the school in Maryland, so it isn't the change in culture wasn't that great between Wolf Knob School and one-room Emerton Elementary School. The only thing is my aunt, they presumed that anybody who came from the South was undereducated, perhaps dumb, and my Aunt Lola, who was quite a reader, and she eventually taught for a while, she went to college and she taught. She was 16 when they moved, 15 when she moved up, and they held her back in 6th grade, and she was really insulted. I guess she made up. She's not in this picture, so she must have gotten out fast, because this was in, what did I say, 1918. But four of my aunts, and one uncle were in there, and then a cousin. The family gatherings always, as I said, this particular picture is special because, I'll read you the note. This was in December the 26th, 1938. This is my grandmother's handwriting. She went to school maybe 4 years total, because after her mother died when she was 11, her father left these 6 children and went west for about a year, and he left the children in the care of his oldest daughter, who was 13, and my grandmother, who was 11, and there was even, there was children, with occasional help from the lady up the road, and grandpa, who lived up the way. So grandma knew what she got married when she was 14, and she had 15 children, one of which died as an infant, but other than that, they all lived to be old and strong. But over the course of those many years, this is the only day, on Monday the 26th, this was the day after Christmas, we had our family dinner with all the children home, all the sons-in-law, We all had a most delightful day, to be remembered. Well, the reason it was long to be remembered is it was the only single afternoon in the history of time when this entire family was together in the same place. They had never been all together before or after. One of the reasons is one of the aunts had moved to California, and she hardly ever came back. There were a few others that moved off to Virginia, but most of them still lived around, not too far away, and for her to have all of her children there at one time, one day, plus the sons-in-law, plus grandchildren and so forth, somebody's feeding all these people too, remember that. And it was grandma and her daughters. And this picture in 1954 was a special occasion. This lady had come from Missouri. She was a double cousin. She was a Kilby cousin and a Pennington cousin. And she and her mother had come from Missouri to visit. And so this is the house I lived in. There's another row of tables over here. But they, of course, had a big family meal to celebrate the visiting of May and Maggie. This is my father and my little sister and my whatever brothers, one brother, two brothers, three brothers, four brothers back there. But what I want to point out to you are the man at the end was married to one of the younger sisters. They had one child. This man here was of Danish extraction. He was not of the clan, and he married Aunt Mary, and they had two children. And Uncle Ralph, he was from the South. But he and Aunt Virgie married late, and they had one child. And then Uncle Ray, he was a native Marylander all the way back to the beginning of time. They had no children. So but you know where the ladies are, of course, they're serving everybody. Again, that's the Southern way. Women don't sit down. The guests may, but not the rest of the people. So that was a fairly typical scene from my youth, these mobs of people having things. And this had happened down there. And then there's the warrior ethic. And you've heard of the Hatfields and McCoys and all the feuds. As far as I know, there were no feuds in my family, or at least nothing involving shooting. But there was a lot of shooting otherwise, except my Kilbys didn't hunt. I don't know why. So my father wasn't a hunter. He hated to kill the animals when they had to butcher and stuff like that. So he was more my kind of man. But this is my mother's family. Although this is a Kilby here. This is Troy Kilby, many of whose, he was the minister down in North Carolina. I think he had 20 or 22 children with two wives. And many of his descendants moved up to Pennsylvania, Lancaster and Chester County, Pennsylvania. So if you run into a Kilby up that way, it's probably a descendant from Troy. He was my grandfather's first cousin. And he officiated at the marriage of my grandfather and his first wife, who died after childbirth. So, and then these are, there might be a Duval in there. I was hoping Sally would be here, perhaps, and some young. And this was the last bear shot in the county, they said. They were very pleased, in about 1900. And you might notice that four of these men are holding things like this. Can you see that? Those are the cubs. And yes, they saved the cubs. And I don't know what happened to all of them, but one of them was a pet, and they kept it chained in the yard. I know, and there it is. See? But they have them up against their chests. And here, I don't know whether you can see that. That's a spotted cat, a wild cat. And they all had their guns. I mean, this is part of the ethos. My grandfather here had apparently gone back to North Carolina, because this is his brother who lived down there, and I think other, like cousins, they all look like the Southern people. Happily, he's killed a deer. There were hardly any deer left up in Harford County. They killed them all off fairly early in the century. So that hunting thing, the great warrior, the hunter, very important. But there's another outlet for the warriorness, and that's the bootlegging, which took place in Cecil County quite a lot, I think. I didn't live in Cecil County until 1961, but when we moved here, there had been a fairly recent death in a mill, an abandoned mill not far away, that they were using for making moonshine. And apparently there was some hard feelings somewhere, and the mill burned down, or the property of the building burned, and there was a body in it. So I don't know I can't remember the rest of the story. But the bootlegging originally was reported in the newspaper as, happening in Kentucky with the revenuers being shot. So early on, that sort of madness was somewhere else. But after the Prohibition in 1919, the first report I found of moonshiners in Cecil County was this Hall, William Hall. And I think I don't know where Red Turkey is. Anybody familiar with that area in Cecil County? But I have a feeling it's around Conoway. That's where all the people gathered, I must say. Well, he was the first person I found who'd been arrested for selling moonshine, and he actually shot at a customer who had a dispute with him, so that's why he was arrested. But it says, William Hall, arrested last week for implication in moonshining and threatening John Russell of Northeast with a revolver, has been held for September term of court. The alleged moonshiner is a newcomer to these parts from Virginia, and 4 of his friends from the same state who reside in Hall's neighborhood went on his bail. So already you can see he's certainly a bad outsider. And that, as I say, the moonshining continued through at least 1950. I don't know, maybe it's still going on. But the other thing, this of course, the farming, that was so, everybody all of my ancestors were farmers, nothing else, except for those English people that came over. And this farming is so embedded in all of our history, the Southern history. And that's what happened when they came north. They came for land, they came for farms, they came to work on farms. Although, in a bit you'll see, and these pictures were all taken down south, but the pictures probably wouldn't look that different in about the same time frame. Although, as the years passed, things modernized up here more, and of course with hills like this, so this isn't even as steep as a lot of them, people were farming practically perpendicular vertical hills, that's the word I want. Vertical hills. It was really, I don't know how they even farmed a lot of those fields, but they were clear cut. They did a lot of grazing though. They didn't cut everything, but here they're cutting grain with scythes and carrying the bundles of grain in the wagon. But what happened is, since they loved the land was wealth to them. These are clips from papers up here, from the Aegis actually. I collected those last year. They're clips from 1906 and still from 1922. And I mean, just one page of the paper was filled with for sale, getting out of farming, can't find help, farm for sale. So all of this land up here, available, and so much easier farming than it was down there. This was the draw. I don't know what kind of deals they got, but it looks like they were just desperate to sell. And it worked. Plus there were a lot of older ladies, for instance, who still owned property and they needed tenant farmers. And everybody worked. I don't believe there was a single one in my family that did desk work or store work, maybe a little bit of mercantile work, but it was always outdoor physical labor. These were my aunts. Some of my aunts. It's unusual because they were wearing overalls, and this was in the 20s, I guess. And I was surprised to see that. They didn't ordinarily wear overalls, but apparently when they were out picking whatever they were picking, they were allowed to do that. All with workhorses, of course. These are some cousins who were. This is a weaver. No, is that a weaver? That might be a weaver, or is it a young? I don't know which. With little children, of course. Everybody's involved. And my father, how he used to look when he milked. Changed a lot when he milked 24 cows, pretty much by himself. And my grandfather, Kilby, was 51 when my father was born, and in every single one of my families, the youngest children were just obligated, or did, stay with their elderly parents. And my father was married and had a family, but he was on the same farm with his parents. And my grandfather was 6'2", and wiry, and my father was about 5'8". And they're very different physically. But my grandfather prided himself so on his ability to cut corn and shock corn. And this picture was taken in 1952, and it ran in the Aegis. My grandmother clipped it out. I found it in one of her scrapbooks. But it was the only place they had found shocked corn for the, to run in the paper as a sign of the season. Typical Thanksgiving sight, fast disappearing from the Harford Sea. And my grandfather had shocked this corn, probably faster than my father, even though he was in his 80s at that point. He died in 54. And he worked all the way up until 3 days before he died. He was 86. So that was the kind, he really liked that physical labor and took great pride in it.
Sounds familiar.
These are the manufacturing scenes down in the South that people left. My great-grandparents from England had their own little woolen mill. That's a little woolen mill in here, which they built in 1900. There's the building. And it ran on water power from Helton Creek, although they did develop a steam engine. And it actually operated until the 1950s. They made woolen yarn down there, which was used to make the baize coverlets in Independence Hall in the 1950s, because Independence Hall needed to change the green covers on the tables in the room, and they determined that the wool yarn made at this mill came closest to the wool that was used in the original table covers. So they had this was the last job the mill did. And they had them produce the yarn, and then it was woven at a nearby craft school. So I'm not, my sister has a piece of the Independence Hall sent her a piece of the baize coverlet that was made from the yarn. But I have a number of things that were made at this mill. But that was one of the industries down there, about the only one, and these were the workers there. So you have about, this is my great-grandfather, and this is his father, who was came from England first, and my grandmother, and my great aunt, and so forth. So a lot of these are family members. Maybe they worked in the mill, but there aren't that many people working in the mill. This over here is mouth of Wilson, which was right in Virginia, and Wilson Creek. And this was a mill, another woolen mill here, where my great-grandfather, when he moved from Providence, Rhode Island, he actually worked at this mill before he went to North Carolina and started his own mill over there. So that was the extent of the industry. And then when people came up here, the others started moving up here, it was a little bit different. And a lot of them came up to work at the Conowingo Dam. And this is a picture of the Conowingo Dam, and I was telling you, Graybeal people, February 18, 1927. Soon after reporting to work, George Graybeal, 35, became sick and went to the office of Dr. Moore, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company's physician at Conowingo, where he died. He and his father and a brother came from North Carolina to Cecil County to work on the project. So you can imagine the change in the world from going from one, maybe, I mean, if they worked in a mill down there at all, which I'm sure they didn't, but there were as many as 3,500 people working at this site at one time. So and the machinery and so forth. So it must have been quite a
What are they
seismic
doing?
shift. What are they doing?
What is the project?
Conowingo Dam.
Oh, the dam. Oh,
That's the dam. So this is I don't know what that is out there. I think it's what do they call it? To divert the water. This is a wooden wall, like, to keep the water over there so they can build.
Coffer dam.
Yeah, very good, you know, your terms. So a few people lost their lives doing it. Of course, it didn't sound like George Graybeal actually fell into the concrete and got buried, which some people did. But the Conowingo Dam work did draw a lot of Southerners up. But by 1930, I looked at the census. Only one person from Virginia reported that he was working at dam construction. Of course, it was finished by then, but maybe there was some follow-up work. Everybody was back at farming again. When I looked at the occupations on the 1930 census, there was a few carpenters, some mechanics, one roadhouse operator, but almost everybody was a farmer or a farm laborer. So they were back on the land again. Now the music wasn't mentioned in the comment, but the whole musical heritage. Here's Ola Bell Reed's book. She's, her family came up from, North Carolina to southern, just around the Oxford area, just over the Pennsylvania line. And, they're still making music in the area. She's in the, what's that, something, down in Washington.
Library of Congress?
Yes, I mean, her music is saved in the, library, Smithsonian, yes, Smithsonian Folkways thing. So, it's the kind of music that's, I was so embarrassed when I was young when people listened to hillbilly music. How could they? Of course, I appreciate it much more now, especially the fiddle and the banjo and the guitars and so forth, that kind of rousing rhythm. And my grandfather, at his old age, grandfather Pennington, he used to go to New River Ranch and he used to go to Sunset Park and he used to stomp around. When I was young, I was so embarrassed. But the first time I went to Scotland, I was walking in the park along the River Ness. It was like 10 o'clock at night or even later, and it was still light. And all of a sudden, from a distance, I hear music. And it was exactly like this hillbilly music that I used to be so embarrassed about. Then I realized, aha, so much of that heritage is still there in that music. And of course, it's always the tragic stories, the great, everything in life is a tragic, or is a, you have to fight. Fight. You fight to get old enough, you fight to mature, you fight to get a husband or a wife. You have to always be in conflict. And the music reflects that. It's always a tragic, almost always a tragic tone. And so the voices sound like these people are the beginnings of the White Top Mountain Band. Again, relatives, Thornton Spencer died this past year, but he and his wife, Emily Spencer, and his children now have a really wonderful, not bluegrass, they call it mountain music, because it's not as driven as bluegrass, but they actually performed up in Frederick about 10 years ago, and down at Salisbury University and so forth. So I've heard them up here, and they're great. Then I just this is the only picture I could find in my family archive of anybody playing an instrument. You might be able to see there's a banjo in there. Can you see that? I think it must be 4th of July. They all look like they have Roman candle or fireworks of some kinds in their hand, and then the banjo player in the middle. So the only thing that a lot of people think of with the Southern heritage here is this music. And but that is a fairly significant contribution. But to tell you the truth, after doing this, I realized there's way more that the Southerners contributed to this area. Mainly, they kept it alive because if they hadn't come up, I don't know what it would have become of Cecil County. You'll notice that these are the population figures for Cecil County through those years that I had in the previous graphic. In 1900, it was 24,662. It went down in 1910. It went down again in 1920. Finally, in 1930, it starts going up again. And then in 1940, up another, not quite 1,000. But everybody was deserting Cecil County. All the old landowners wanted out. They wanted to go to the city. They just didn't want to live here anymore. So the Southerners came up, filled the void, did the work, kept the farms going, and now are pretty much, in a lot of family roots. A lot of people in the county derive from the South. So, all right. Questions, comments, additions, subtractions?
I'm sorry, this probably isn't related in any other way except that I'm a little quirky. The guy that was standing in about the third picture, he was really tall. Is he as tall as he looks? Because I was counting boards and things like that, and he was.
With the bear?
I don't know if it was. I think it was about the third or fourth one back. There's 3 or 4 guys.
I don't know how to back this
They
thing
all
up.
had guns and everything.
Oh, that's with the bear. He was tall. He was, my grandfather, Kilby, was about 6'2", and that was his cousin, and I'm pretty sure, I never saw him in person,
Yeah,
of course.
he looks like he's about 6'8" or 6'.
No, I don't think so, I don't think so. Perhaps so.
Because everybody else is standing on chairs,
Oh,
and he's still standing on the ground.
let me go here. I'm going back. I'll have to look it
Oh,
up.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it's fine with me, if you have a curiosity. Let's see, I just don't know how to operate this machine. Back up.
Let me see if I can help.
Back. Where are my arrows? Oh, here we go, good, I found them. See, this is what happens when I don't have my own machine. Go. There.
Yeah, see, he's still.
Oh, I think there's a hump in the ground in there.
He's still standing on the ground,
Yeah,
everybody
it's-
else
see,
is
it's-
standing on a chair.
The ground isn't as slanted, so I think he gets an advantage there. He gets about 6 inches of advantage on the ground. So I'd say he's probably 6'2" or 3", or 4", but not 6'8". Yes?
You didn't mention, when you were talking about population decline, one of the things you didn't mention was military service.
Oh.
Did the decline have something to do with that too?
I don't know for sure, but I do want to mention that the numbers of people from those southern states have been skewed because Perry Point had as many as 1,000 males, and or more, maybe more. But a lot of the males at Perry Point as patients or workers were obviously not here volunteer. I mean, to live in the land. So military.
Doesn't make any difference.
I'm sure it would have made some difference, but up to 1940, there wasn't that much
Well,
difference.
I was thinking of the catastrophic numbers of deaths in the First World War,
Oh,
more
right.
than the second even. Did that really hit the population?
A little bit, but it's surprising how few, at least in the Fair Hill area, there were very few casualties up there. And there is a statue in Elkton that, honoring the doughboys, and I can't remember, but I don't think there were that many casualties in the county. Right? Anybody else know?
No, I was gonna ask another question.
Okay.
You showed the population in 1940 at 26,000, but during the war, many times that actually migrated to the area.
Right.
I've heard as many as 85,000, of which 15,000 was just in Triumph, and then the national
Yes.
fireworks at tens of thousands.
Yes.
Given how significant that number is compared to that, how did that change the demographics in terms of?
Well, that's what I don't know, because as I say, the census is not available for 1950, so I can't see, but I know it did. But in looking at the census figures for 1950, they're not hugely different. The population in Cecil County stayed the same forever almost. It was really flat. And then all of a sudden, I think maybe in the 70s, 60s, 70s, it finally began to go up some. But it was remarkably since the beginning of time. But I know that many people came to work at Triumph and other places like that. Plus there were Bainbridge people, but they didn't necessarily settle down. Yes?
When you brought up the original movement south, I thought that was really interesting. I've been doing family research in my family tree, and 9 generations back, they landed from Cork, Ireland to the Calvert area.
Oh, really?
And then they migrated down to eastern Kentucky. And my father was the one that came back up from eastern Kentucky up to the Rising Sun area back in like the 60s.
Well, as I said, this is more than your family and my family.
Yeah.
A lot of people. It really amazed me. I had not realized how much that was. Of course, there was a great deal of migration going on west from this same pocket. In my grandfather Pennington's family, he's the only one that came up to Maryland. He had 4 siblings that moved out to Missouri. Missouri was the other land of opportunity. So the push onward to the west, many of the families went out there. And of course the southern influence all through the south tier of the United States and the ranch culture and everywhere. I tell you, there's a book called, it was written by Webb, who was a Secretary of the Army or Defense or something. James Webb, yes. And it's something about, he discussed how the southern culture has made America what it is today in terms of the warriors and all that. All the warrior presidents and the warrior this and that were from this same, yes, the Scots-Irish, the fighting people. Yes.
I did a Rhodes Scholar trip to Lake Junaluska, which is way west, like almost on it's in North Carolina, but it's way west. And that, you circled that area, and it was called Appalachian Women.
Oh,
And they talked about the Scotch-Irish and of course the Cherokee there.
right.
And one of the things that we did, they had all about the migration and what they did, and there's a Tartan museum that we took a field trip to, and like the Brady's or whatever, they might have those tartans in there. But one of I'm losing it. Oh, they showed us a movie, and the movie obviously has been out for a while, but it was about the music. And we had dulcimer players and weavers and things like that. But the movie was about somebody going in to collect all the folk
Yes.
songs.
Mrs. Campbell was his name.
I don't know, I can't remember what the movie was, but it's a great movie.
Fortunately, somebody did.
What was it?
What was it?
It was a song catcher.
That was a song catcher, the song catcher. Well, there's another book that came out, bestseller book recently called The Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah, I just read it.
Wait, I realize that great disaffectation, whatever is right, the distress that the mill workers and all the people in that area, Ohio, that came from Kentucky, went up to work in the mills and the steel plants and so forth in Ohio and Michigan, and they're all, suffering from drug problems, and they're just, total collapse of their society. It's because they left the farm. They have to be on the land. I was thinking about that today. And so it really is that need of land and contact with outdoors. And you notice, this probably is something I shouldn't bring up. When I read the obituaries of the young men who I'm sure have died of a drug overdose locally, almost all of them say he loved the outdoors, he loved to be out fishing and so forth, but that wasn't enough to save him. But it's that whole idea of trying to correct that removal from the land that your genes tell you need. Yes. There's the man behind me raised first, so.
Speaking from personal experience, being raised in a dairy farm, and I'm a damn Yankee within the site of Cornwall, Ontario, Canada. Raised in a dairy farm, majored in vocational agriculture, trillion proof. You can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy.
But it sure feels good to not have to get up and milk at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's the thing. My family, my brother sold the herd, and there's nobody farming in my family except for one niece who now moved up to Vermont because they could afford the farm up there. So that's the end of the line for the farm, our heritage. So.
Was there interaction with a lot of Indians, American
Not
Indians?
at the very start. One of the Osborne ancestors supposedly was killed when he was out long hunting. They'd go out hunting and collecting game far from home and bring it back, and they were out camping, and one of them was killed, the other was shot, had to run home without his shoes on or something like that. So there are other tales, and they did have the Osbornes had the Osborne Fort down near the New River when they first moved there to protect themselves. But after, I guess they chased them all away or something, and so they weren't as far down as that lake that the lady was talking about. That's around the southern part of the Carolina border. Yes.
I grew up in Newark, Delaware, and there were several people who worked at Triumph down here, and they called them the Boom Boom Girls.
Yeah.
That's what they were called, the ladies who worked down here.
And they did
Yeah.
come up.
Some of my friends' mothers.
Yeah. In the 1950s, a lot of single women came from somewhere else to work in Elton. That would never have happened early on.
Right.
But a lot of them had relatives that they moved up to stay with here, aunts or somebody like that, so they stayed in New York, and they were actually looking for a husband, of course.
Right.
And, so they earned their money. One woman I talked to down in Harford County said that she had gotten a scholarship when she graduated from high school. She'd gotten a scholarship to go to college, but her father, true to Southern heritage, said girls don't need to go to college, and so he wouldn't let her go to college. And so she moved to Harford County to stay with an aunt, and she worked in an office up here. But that was, you know, the New World was actually reaching the crevices of the mountains down there at that point. And so there was the opportunity. My aunt said they moved up. One of the reasons to move north was that it had gotten so there was nobody to marry but your cousin down there. In fact, my oldest aunt did marry her cousin, but the rest of them did escape that. I mean, it was distant, but she married her first cousin, I think. But the kids are okay. They're still farming. Any other comments? You had a question back there, my Weaver.
Well, I just want to tell you that your mother told me one time, she said that there are some that just have the mountain in them and gotta stay near the mountain or get back to it. And she patted my hand and said, "You're one of them."
Well, it was interesting that when I was in high school, elementary and high school, there was a wave of new Southerners coming up. And I was remembering in second or third grade, I went to a 3-room elementary school that my father had gone to, so I wasn't exactly in a modern world myself. But she came to school and I thought, I thought she was so pretty. Her name was Laura, and I didn't know anybody named Laura. But her mother sent her to school with a rag wrapped around her neck with probably Vicks salve underneath it or something to ward off the evil spirits. And you know, right away she was just different. You know, nobody up here would do something like that. And then when I was in high school, I found out even some of the kids that seemed to be pretty adapted, their families had moved up when they were, you know, just a year or two from finishing high school, and they didn't like it up here at all. And a lot of them moved back down. You know, they were at home back down there. You know, they went back. Sorry, I think it's probably. Oh, I never go over. Oh, this is the first time I've ever done it. We started like.